He watched the young cashier, Mark, with a gentle, almost invisible gesture, cover the desperate mother's shortfall. Her whispered, tearful, "Thank you," seemed to echo in the sudden silence that enveloped the older man observing nearby. Ed Smith, a billionaire CEO, hidden beneath a worn-out jacket and a lifetime of regret. A single devastating thought sliced through him sharper than any market crash. This young man, with barely enough for himself, just showed more wealth than my entire empire holds. He's not just saving her. Dear God, is he saving me? The answer to that profound question, and the incredible journey it ignites, promises an ending that will leave you truly speechless. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single turn in this story, and share with us in the comments below. What does this powerful first encounter make you feel or question? The city sprawled beneath Edward Sterling's 50th floor office, like a vast, intricate circuit board, streams of morning traffic flowing like data along its arteries. From this height, the individual cars were indistinguishable, a collective hum, much like the thousands of employees who formed the bedrock of Sterling Corporation. Edward, a man whose name was synonymous with decisive leadership and shrewd investments, stood before the panoramic window, not seeing the empire he commanded, but a reflection of a growing, disquieting unease. The latest quarterly reports lay on his expansive mahogany desk, numbers, polished profits acceptable, yet threaded with an undeniable undercurrent of something wrong. Declining morale in the retail division, whispers of inefficiencies, a subtle but persistent erosion of the Sterling standard he and his late father before him had painstakingly built. His father, Arthur Sterling Sr., had been a man forged in a different era. He'd started Sterling Corp with a single storefront and a belief that employees weren't just cogs, but the very heart of the enterprise. "Take care of your people, Edward," he'd said, his voice raspy with age, but firm with conviction, just weeks before he passed, "and they'll take care of the business. That's the only legacy worth a damn." Edward had nodded, a younger, more idealistic man, then genuinely believing he would uphold that creed. But somewhere along the ascent to this gilded cage, amidst boardroom battles and shareholder demands, the faces of those people had blurred, replaced by spreadsheets and profit margins. A particularly bitter memory surfaced. A cost-cutting initiative 5 years prior, his signature stark on the directive. It had saved millions, earned him accolades, but he'd later heard whispers of how it had decimated a small, loyal department, good people losing their livelihoods. The thought still left a coppery taste of regret in his mouth. This current unease felt like an echo of that old failure, a warning he couldn't ignore. Miles away in a neighborhood where the skyscrapers were just a distant, steely mirage, the bell above the door of the corner stop a Sterling-owned convenience store chimed a cheerful welcome. Marcus Mark Cole looked up from meticulously arranging a display of local newspapers, a warm, genuine smile instantly lighting his face. "Morning, Mrs. Gable," he called out, his voice a balm in the bustling morning. Mrs. Eleanor Gable, a woman whose silver hair was always perfectly coiffed, clutched her purse. "Oh, Marcus, dear, you're a lifesaver. I completely forgot to pick up my usual. And is that Mr. Dean I see skulking by the coffee machine?" Mark chuckled a rich, easy sound. "He's just ensuring the brew meets his exacting standards, I believe." "Morning, Mr. Dean." The usual Mr. Arthur Dean, a retired history teacher with twinkling eyes, turned holding a steaming cup. "Only if you've remembered the extra sugar, young man. Unlike some people, my standards are consistently high." He winked at Mrs. Gable. This was the rhythm of the corner stop, a rhythm Mark orchestrated with an effortless grace. He knew Mrs. Gable's preferred brand of tea, and that Mr. Dean secretly enjoyed a gossip magazine alongside his serious broadsheets. He noticed when a regular seemed down, offering a quiet word of encouragement, or simply a more patient ear. He wasn't just a cashier. He was a community linchpin, a steady, reassuring presence in a world that often felt too rushed, too impersonal. He did it not for praise, nor for the modest paycheck that barely covered his own bills, but because, quite simply, it was the right way to treat people. It was a philosophy as ingrained in him as his own heartbeat. Back in his sterile office, Edward Sterling swiveled in his leather chair, the glossy reports feeling cold beneath his fingertips. He'd had a conference call with regional managers. Assurances had been given, action plans proposed. All the usual corporate speak that sounded efficient, but often signified very little real change. He could send in an audit team, a turnaround specialist. He could issue sterner directives, but these were the methods of the Edward Sterling he was becoming, not the man his father had hoped he'd be. He needed to see to feel the truth, unfiltered by layers of middle management. The idea, when it first flickered, seemed preposterous. Him, Edward Sterling, on the shop floor, he almost laughed. Then a strange resolve began to solidify. What if he stripped away the suit, the title, the insulation of wealth and authority? Later that evening, in the vast, echoing walk-in closet of his penthouse apartment, the absurdity of it all struck him with full force. He held up a pair of ill-fitting work trousers he'd had his discreet personal assistant procure, along with a faded generic polo shirt. He looked at his reflection, a man more accustomed to bespoke tailoring, looking utterly lost in the cheap fabric. A short, dry laugh escaped him. "Right, Ed Smith," he muttered to his reflection, trying out the common, unassuming alias he'd concocted. "Let's see if you can actually stock a shelf without bringing down the entire aisle." He imagined his board of directors seeing him like this. The thought was almost liberating. The discomfort was real. The clothes felt like a costume for a play he hadn't rehearsed, but beneath it, a spark of something he hadn't felt in years, a nervous, almost exhilarating anticipation, began to glow. This wasn't just about numbers anymore, or even about upholding a legacy. It was about finding something he'd lost within himself. With a deep breath, Edward Sterling, the titan of industry, made a decision that would set him on a collision course with a reality he had long since forgotten. He folded the work clothes, a strange sense of purpose settling over him. Tomorrow, Ed Smith would report for duty. The fluorescent lights of the corner stop hummed with a monotonous energy that was a universe away from the silent, refined glow of Edward Sterling's office. Dressed in his still unfamiliar work attire, the polo shirt already feeling a size too small and the trousers a touch too stiff, Ed Smith received his first set of instructions from Mark Cole. Mark, with an easy-going patience that Edward found both admirable and, in his current state of concealed identity, slightly unnerving, demonstrated the arcane rituals of the checkout counter. "All right, Ed," Mark said, tapping the side of an aging barcode scanner. "This old soldier can be a bit temperamental. You got to find the sweet spot, see?" He swiped an item, and the machine emitted a reluctant beep. "Sometimes she needs a little coaxing, and if she really acts up well, we have our ways." He grinned a flash of warmth that made him seem younger than his late 20s. Edward, a man who could dissect a multi-billion-dollar merger before breakfast, found himself utterly flummoxed by the scanner. His first attempts resulted in a series of frustrated rapid-fire beeps or complete silence. He fumbled with a bag of potato chips, nearly sending it flying. Mark, witnessing this, suppressed a smile. "Easy there, Ed. You handle that scanner like it's an unexploded bomb. Relax, it only bites on Tuesdays, and mostly just Peterson." He winked the casual mention of their manager's name, loaded with an unspoken camaraderie that Edward, the actual owner of Sterling Corporation, felt a strange pang for. His first few hours were a masterclass in humility. He was tasked with restocking shelves, a job that sounded deceptively simple. Yet aligning soup cans into perfectly symmetrical rows proved a challenge for hands more accustomed to signing checks than stacking tins. He overheard snippets of conversations between other staff during a brief lull, hushed complaints about the faulty air conditioning unit that management, meaning Mr. Chad Peterson, had dismissed as not a priority, and concerns about shift changes made with little notice. These weren't abstract data points on a report. They were the daily irritants, the small abrasions that wore down morale. Once, when discussing a delivery delay, Ed almost blurted out, "Well, the Q3 logistics recalibration should optimize that by—" He caught himself just in time, a flush creeping up his neck, and stammered, "By next week, hopefully. If the trucks get in." The nearby stock boy gave him a quizzical look before shrugging. Lunchtime arrived, and Edward realized with a jolt that he hadn't thought to pack anything. The idea of Ed Smith sauntering into a high-end deli was ludicrous. He stood awkwardly near the staff room, unsure of the protocol. Mark, munching on a simple sandwich, noticed his hesitation. "Forgot your lunch, Ed?" he asked, his tone casual, devoid of pity. Edward mumbled something about being new and disorganized. Without a word, Mark reached into his worn backpack, pulled out a slightly bruised apple and a granola bar, and offered them to him. "Here, take these. Can't have you fainting on your first day. Bad for business, you know." He said it with another of those disarming smiles. "Oh, I couldn't," Edward began, the unfamiliar feeling of accepting charity warring with genuine hunger. "Nonsense," Mark insisted gently. "Plenty more where that came from, besides someone shared with me when I first started. Just paying it forward." Edward accepted the food, a complicated knot of gratitude and shame tightening in his chest. This simple act of generosity, offered without a second thought from someone who likely had little to spare, felt more significant than any multi-course business lunch he'd ever attended. Later that afternoon, the store grew busy. A young woman, her face etched with fatigue, approached Mark's checkout. She had a toddler in one arm who was fretfully rubbing his eyes, and a small basket of essentials in the other. A carton of milk, a loaf of bread, some baby food. As Mark scanned her items, the total flashed on the screen. The woman's face fell. She fumbled in her purse, her fingers trembling slightly as she counted out a few crumpled bills and some loose change. She was short. Edward, stocking a nearby shelf, pretended not to watch, but his attention was riveted. "Oh," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson. I thought I had enough. I'm so sorry. Can you take off the baby food? I'll manage." The toddler, sensing his mother's distress, began to whimper. Mr. Peterson was nowhere in sight, likely ensconced in his small back office. Another cashier at the adjacent counter seemed pointedly busy avoiding eye contact. Edward felt a surge of his old CEO instinct. Solve the problem, make it go away. But he was Ed Smith, powerless a spectator. Mark paused for a fraction of a second. His expression softened with an empathy that seemed to radiate from him. He glanced quickly at the whimpering child, then back at the mother's distressed face. Then so subtly that if Edward hadn't been watching intently, he might have missed it. Mark's own hand slipped into his pocket, then moved swiftly over the till as he pressed a few buttons. The payment accepted chime sounded. "There you go," Mark said, his voice calm and kind as he bagged her groceries. "Looks like you had just enough after all. Have a good day now." The young woman stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. "But are you sure?" Mark simply smiled. "Positive. Don't you worry about it." She hesitated. Then a look of profound, almost disbelieving gratitude washed over her face. "Thank you," she choked out. "Oh, thank you. You have no idea." She hurried out, clutching her groceries and her child, as if escaping before the mirage of kindness could evaporate. Mark turned to the next customer, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But Edward Sterling had seen it all. He stood frozen, a can of beans halfway to the shelf. The quiet, almost invisible compassion of Marcus Cole, an employee earning minimum wage in one of his thousands of stores, had just delivered a blow more profound than any market crash or hostile takeover he had ever faced. It wasn't just kindness, it was a quiet defiance against the indifference of the world, a small personal intervention that had saved someone's dignity. And Edward knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was a kind of wealth his billions could never buy, and a type of leadership he had utterly failed to practice. The foundation of his ivory tower suddenly felt terrifyingly fragile. The relative anonymity Edward Sterling had sought as Ed Smith began to fray around the edges with the more frequent appearances of Mr. Chad Peterson, the manager of the corner stop. Peterson was a man who seemed to wear his authority like an ill-fitting, slightly too loud suit. He'd stride into the store with an air of beleaguered importance, his gaze sweeping over the aisles, not with an eye for improvement, but for infractions. His interactions with staff were curt, often laced with a condescending edge, and his praise was as rare as a perfectly ripe avocado in winter. Edward, now a few days into his undercover role, quickly discerned that Peterson was a significant part of the store's underlying malaise. He saw Peterson publicly admonish a young stock girl, Sarah, for being 5 minutes late despite her hushed explanation of a delayed bus, his voice sharp enough to turn heads. He witnessed Peterson dismiss Mark's polite suggestion for a more efficient way to handle morning deliveries, a suggestion Mark had clearly put thought into, with a wave of his hand and a just stick to the roster Cole. "I'll do the thinking around here." Edward had to physically bite back a retort, the irony of Peterson's statement almost making him choke. Peterson seemed to have a particular, if subtle, dislike for Ed Smith. Perhaps it was Edward's age, his initial clumsiness, or simply the fact that he was new and therefore an easy target. Peterson would often assign Ed the most tedious tasks, cleaning the perpetually sticky floor around the soda fountain or reorganizing the notoriously chaotic back storeroom. He'd miscall his name sometimes, Ted, sometimes Fred, never quite Ed, as if remembering it was beneath him. "Fred, did you or did you not restack those cereal boxes by sell-by date, like I asked?" he'd call out across the store, his tone implying an inevitable failing. Edward, the man who chaired international trade delegations, would have to meekly reply, "Yes, Mr. Peterson." Right away, Mr. Peterson, the charade, grating on his nerves more each day. The other employees had developed their own coping mechanisms for Peterson. Edward noticed the almost imperceptible eye rolls when Peterson launched into one of his self-important monologues about corporate synergy, a phrase Edward suspected Peterson himself didn't fully understand. Once in the supposed privacy of the narrow tea-break alcove, Edward overheard Sarah and another young worker, David, quietly mimicking Peterson's distinctive, slightly nasal way of saying efficiency. It was a small, fleeting moment of shared rebellious humor, a tiny pressure valve in the otherwise tense atmosphere Peterson cultivated. One afternoon, Mark was meticulously helping Mrs. Eleanor Gable, who was having trouble deciding between 2 brands of biscuits, offering patient advice, and even looking up an ingredient for her on his phone. Peterson, emerging from his office, observed the interaction with a frown. As soon as Mrs. Gable had made her purchase and left, smiling, Peterson descended upon Mark. "Cole," he began, his voice tight, "while it's commendable that you're so invested in Mrs. Gable's biscuit dilemma, your primary function is to keep the line moving. We're not running a social club here. Time is money, or have you forgotten the Sterling Corp motto? He didn't wait for an answer. Mark's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Gable is a loyal customer, Mr. Peterson. A little extra attention ensures she remains one. His voice was low respectful, but with an undercurrent of firmness that Edward, observing from behind a display of discounted sodas, deeply admired. Peterson scoffed. Loyalty doesn't show up on my weekly performance metrics, Cole. Transaction speed does. Remember that. He then turned his attention to a newly delivered pallet of goods that was admittedly slightly obstructing a secondary aisle. And get this cleared immediately. It's a safety hazard. Don't need any lawsuits on my watch because someone can't follow basic stocking protocols. He glanced pointedly at Ed Smith, who was nowhere near the pallet at that moment, before striding back to his office. The injustice of it was palpable. Mark had been providing excellent customer service, the very thing Sterling Corporation purportedly valued. The pallet had only just arrived, and Mark had been about to deal with it before Mrs. Gable required his assistance. Later, Edward saw Mark in the back room, methodically breaking down the empty boxes from the pallet, his movements efficient, but lacking their usual quiet energy. He's quite the motivator, isn't he? Edward ventured, attempting a neutral tone, as Ed Smith. Mark paused, a weary smile touching his lips. Mr. Peterson has his methods. We all just try to do our jobs, Ed. He didn't elaborate, didn't complain, but the set of his shoulders spoke volumes. Edward felt a familiar anger churning within him, hotter this time, mixed with a frustrating sense of impotence. He was the CEO. He could fire Peterson with a single phone call, but as Ed Smith, he was just another downtrodden employee, a silent witness. He saw now how this kind of petty tyranny, this constant chipping away at dignity and initiative, could poison a workplace far more effectively than any grand corporate failing. It wasn't one single policy from head office that was crushing morale here. It was the daily grinding implementation of those policies by men like Chad Peterson, men who wielded their little bit of power like a weapon. The efficiency Peterson so often touted was in reality creating an environment of fear and resentment. Edward had come undercover, expecting to find systemic flaws, perhaps outdated processes or poor resource allocation. He was finding those, yes, but he was also finding something more insidious, a fundamental breakdown in human respect, a culture where employees were treated as expendable resources rather than valued individuals. And he, Edward Sterling, had allowed men like Peterson to become the face of his company on the front lines. The realization was a cold weight in his gut. The carefully constructed facade of Sterling Corporation, as viewed from his 50th floor window, was beginning to crumble, revealing a far uglier truth beneath. The late afternoon sun, usually a benign presence through the front windows of the corner stop, suddenly seemed to dim. A low, ominous hum emanated from the back of the store, near the aging refrigeration units, growing louder with each passing second. Then, with a series of sputtering pops and a disconcerting clunk, the main lights flickered violently and died, plunging the store into a disorienting twilight, illuminated only by the emergency exit signs and the fading daylight. The refrigerators fell silent. Panic, muted, at first began to ripple through the customers. A child started to cry. What in the blazes? Mr. Chad Peterson's voice, sharp and unnerved, cut through the sudden gloom from his office doorway. Power outage. Don't just stand there. Someone check the breakers. Mark Cole, who had been calmly reassuring, a startled Mrs. Eleanor Gable, immediately moved towards the staff area where the main panel was located. I'm on it, Mr. Peterson. Edward, or Ed Smith, felt a cold dread seep into him. He distinctly remembered a capital expenditure request for upgrading the store's ancient electrical system just 8 months prior. It had crossed his desk, and he, under pressure to trim Q4 budgets across the retail division, had personally deferred it with a curt re-evaluate next fiscal year. The memory now burned like a hot coal. Peterson fumbling for his phone, likely to call someone, anyone, to blame, was a picture of ineffectual panic. This is a disaster. All the refrigerated stock will spoil. Sterling Corp will have my head for this. He babbled, his eyes darting around wildly. Mark returned from the back, his expression grim. It's not the breakers, Mr. Peterson. Looks like the main transformer in the back alley blew. I smelled burning insulation just before everything went out. We need to evacuate the customers calmly and call the emergency services and the power company now. Evacuate. Are you insane, Cole? Peterson shrieked, his voice cracking. Think of the looting, the lost sales. No, we secure the store first. He jabbed a finger at Ed Smith, and you, David, block the main entrance. Don't let anyone else in or out until I figure this out. Mr. Peterson, that's against safety regulations, Mark stated firmly, his voice rising above the manager's panic. We need to ensure everyone is safe first. The stock is insured. People aren't. It was in that moment of chaos, with Peterson issuing nonsensical orders and Mark trying to maintain control, that Ed Smith moved with a decisiveness that startled everyone, including himself. He saw a wisp of smoke curling from under the door of the electrical room at the far end of the store, a room Peterson hadn't even mentioned. Mark Edwards said, his voice carrying an unexpected authority that cut through Peterson's panicked shouts. There's smoke from the electrical room. We need fire extinguishers and everyone out. Now. Peterson, call 911. That's an order. Peterson, momentarily stunned by the command, in Ed Smith's voice, gaped at him. An order. Who do you think you are, Smith, giving me? But Edward was already moving his earlier awkwardness, gone replaced by the focused energy of a man used to commanding in crises. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from its wall, mounting his movements, surprisingly adept. David Sarah helped Mark guide everyone out through the front. Calmly, please. The other staff, catching the urgency and clarity in Ed's tone and sensing Mark's immediate agreement, began to usher the bewildered customers towards the exit. The brief pre-reveal humorous moment occurred when a uniformed security guard from the small Sterling Corp patrol car that happened to be passing by rushed in. Seeing Ed, a disheveled older man in a cheap polo, competently directing the evacuation and assessing the smoke, the young guard instinctively asked, "Sir, what are your orders?" Edward, without missing a beat, replied, "Secure the perimeter, keep onlookers back, and radio for immediate fire department assistance. Potential electrical fire." The guard, despite a flicker of confusion at taking orders from what appeared to be a store clerk, nodded sharply and rushed to comply, the sheer force of Edward's ingrained authority overriding any questions. Mark, meanwhile, had already directed most customers out and was heading towards the electrical room with another extinguisher. Peterson, however, seemed to snap out of his stupor, his panic morphing into a desperate attempt to reassert control and find a scapegoat. "Cole, what are you doing?" he yelled, grabbing Mark's arm as he tried to approach the smoky room. "This is probably your fault. You were probably messing with something back there. I'm holding you responsible for this." That was the spark that ignited Edward Sterling's carefully maintained facade. Seeing Mark, the only person who had shown consistent competence and compassion, being unjustly accused by this blustering fool in a crisis caused by his own corporate negligence, was more than he could bear. He strode forward, his eyes blazing with a cold fire that made Peterson instinctively recoil. "That's enough." Peterson Edwards' voice was no longer that of Ed Smith. It was deeper resonant, filled with an icy command that echoed with boardroom authority. He reached up and, with a deliberate gesture, pulled off the slightly askew cheap baseball cap he'd been wearing as part of his disguise, his silver-grey hair catching the dim emergency lights. "You will not accuse this man of anything." Edward continued his gaze, pinning Peterson to the spot. "The responsibility for the state of this store's infrastructure, and therefore this incident, lies significantly higher up the chain of command." Mark stared, extinguisher forgotten in his hand, his face a mask of utter disbelief as he looked from the transformed Ed Smith to the cowering Peterson. The few remaining staff members froze, sensing a monumental shift in the dynamics. Peterson, emboldened by confusion, stammered. "And just who in the blazes do you think you are, Smith, to talk to me like that? You're fired. You hear me?" "Fired." A grim, mirthless smile touched Edward Sterling's lips. "Actually, Peterson," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level that nonetheless filled the tense space. "I rather think it's the other way around." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "My name is Edward Sterling. I am the CEO of Sterling Corporation. And you, Mr. Peterson, have a great deal to answer for." The only sounds in the corner stop were the distant wail of approaching sirens and the stunned, ragged gasps of those who had just witnessed the unmasking. The truth, in all its raw, shocking, and painful clarity, had finally been laid bare. The arrival of the fire department and emergency services blurred into a sequence of efficient professional actions that Edward Sterling, back in his role as CEO, directed with a calm he didn't entirely feel. The small electrical fire was quickly contained, deemed to have originated from the catastrophically failed transformer he had neglected to replace. Customers were confirmed safe if shaken. Mr. Chad Peterson, after sputtering a few more incoherent protests, had deflated like a punctured balloon under Edward's icy authoritative gaze. He was formally suspended, pending a full and immediate investigation, and escorted off the premises by Sterling Corporation's head of security, who had arrived with astonishing speed once the CEO's identity was known. As the immediate crisis subsided and the store was temporarily closed, Edward found himself standing amidst the slight disarray. The faint smell of smoke still lingering, the scattered goods, the eerie silence of the now darkened aisles. The adrenaline that had fueled his unmasking drained away, leaving behind a hollow ache of profound self-reproach. Each act of kindness he'd witnessed from Marcus Cole, each instance of Peterson's petty cruelty, each overheard complaint from the staff now replayed in his mind, not as observations, but as indictments of his own detached leadership. The truth he had sought was a bitter pill he had allowed his father's legacy to tarnish, had prioritized sterile profits over the people who were its lifeblood. The opulence of his office, his life, suddenly felt like a mockery. He asked Mark Cole to wait to speak with him privately in the small, cluttered back office that had been Peterson's domain. Mark, who had handled himself with quiet composure throughout the emergency, now looked at Edward with an unreadable expression, a mixture of shock, confusion, and perhaps a flicker of something that looked like betrayal. The easy camaraderie he'd shown Ed Smith was gone, replaced by a guarded formality. Marcus Edward began the name feeling unfamiliar on his tongue after days of Mark. He eschewed the managerial chair, remaining standing. "I owe you an apology far greater than words can convey, for the deception, for what you and the others here have endured, for my own blindness." Mark was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Mr. Sterling," he finally said, his voice low and even. Why all of this?" "The disguise working here." "What were you hoping to find?" Edward met his gaze directly, no longer hiding behind any facade. "The truth, Marcus. A truth I should never have lost sight of. I was looking for what was broken in my company, and I found it was more than just faulty wiring." He paused, the shame raw in his voice. I found it in men like Peterson, whom I allowed to manage, and I found it in myself for being so far removed that I didn't see, or perhaps didn't want to see, the reality of what it's like for the people who actually make this company run. So what now? Mark asked the question, direct, cutting through any pretense. A new manager for the corner, stop a memo about corporate values. There was no insolence in his tone, only a weary skepticism. More than that, Edward said, his voice filled with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. Much more. This isn't about one store, Marcus. It's about everything. It's about changing how Sterling Corporation operates from the top down. He then outlined his immediate plans: a full audit of all store-level management, a review of wages and benefits, an overhaul of the internal feedback systems. And then he looked at Mark. I want you to help me do it. I'm creating a new role, a senior position, Director of Employee Experience and Operational Integrity. It would report directly to me. I want you to take it. Mark stared at him, stunned into silence for a second time that day. Then a dry, humorless laugh escaped him. Me, Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, I'm a cashier. What do I know about corporate directorships? You know more than most of my executives, Marcus Edwards stated plainly. You know what it's like on the ground. You understand people. You have integrity. Those are qualities I desperately need. Mark walked over to the small, grimy window, looking out at the now departing emergency vehicles. You come in here, turn our lives upside down, reveal you're the man at the very top. And now you offer me a job like that. It's a lot to take in, sir. He turned back. How do I know this isn't just a reaction? A way to fix a PR problem if this gets out? Edward nodded slowly. That's a fair question. And I know I haven't given you much reason to trust me today. All I can say is that what I saw here, what I saw in you, has fundamentally changed me. This isn't about PR. This is about atonement. And I can't do it without people who genuinely care, people who aren't afraid to tell me the truth. The position is real. The need is real. The next day, news of the CEO undercover incident, as it was quickly dubbed internally, began to filter through Sterling Corporation, initially with disbelief, then with a ripple of trepidation amongst the executive ranks. Edward called an emergency meeting of his senior leadership. When he walked into the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. There was a rather awkward, yet telling moment when one vice president, a notorious sycophant, known for his disdain for frontline staff, began a preamble about the inherent challenges of motivating certain, less ambitious elements in the workforce. He trailed off his face, paling as he caught Edward's flinty stare, realizing he was speaking to a CEO who had just spent a week as one of those elements. Edward, without raising his voice, proceeded to deliver a scathing, honest account of his experiences, sparing no one, least of all himself. He announced the immediate suspension of several regional managers whose districts showed patterns similar to what he'd witnessed. He then unveiled his plan for a company-wide public address. Later that week, Edward Sterling, looking more somber and earnest than his employees had ever seen him, appeared in a live video broadcast to every Sterling Corporation branch and office. He didn't read from a script. He spoke from the heart, recounting his time as Ed Smith, admitting his failings as a leader, and apologizing directly and unequivocally for the conditions many of them endured. He outlined the sweeping changes he intended to implement, emphasizing that this was not a temporary fix, but a fundamental shift in the company's philosophy. He mentioned an exceptional employee whose integrity had been a catalyst, though he didn't name Mark directly in that broad address. When Edward returned to the corner stop a few days later to oversee the initial repairs and speak with the other staff, dressed in his usual impeccable suit, Sarah, the young stock girl, saw him, and her eyes widened. "Mr. Ed, wow, you clean up real nice, sir," she stammered, a blush rising on her cheeks, the blend of her previous familiarity with Ed Smith and the awe of his true status, creating a moment of light, human awkwardness that Edward found strangely grounding. He sought out Mark, who had taken a few days off at Edward's insistence. They met in the same back office, now cleaner, brighter. "I saw your address, Mr. Sterling," Mark said, his tone still measured, but with a new attentiveness in his eyes. "It was unexpected." "Was it convincing?" Edward asked. Mark considered. "It was a start, a very public start. That takes courage." He looked at Edward, a long, searching look. "This new role you mentioned. If I were to consider it, I'd need assurances. Real power to make changes, not just a title. And I'd need to know you're truly committed to this for the long haul." Edward Sterling felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't capitulation. It was negotiation. It was the beginning of an earned trust. "You would have it, Marcus," he said, his voice firm. "My full support and a direct line. No bureaucracy, just a commitment to making things right." Mark was silent for another moment. Then a very faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Well, Mr. Sterling," he said, "perhaps we should talk about the details." The transition for Marcus Mark Cole from the familiar rhythm of the corner stop to the hushed, carpeted corridors of Sterling Corporation's headquarters was, to put it mildly, an adjustment. His new office, while significantly larger than the break room he was used to, initially felt more like an elegant cage. He was faced with a labyrinth of corporate procedures, endless email chains, and meetings filled with acronyms that sounded like a foreign language. There were moments of doubt, of feeling like Ed Smith masquerading in a suit far too expensive for his comfort. Some executives' holdovers from the old guard treated him with a polite but visible skepticism, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes when Mr. Sterling's special project entered the room. But Mark possessed a quiet tenacity and an unshakable moral compass honed by years of frontline experience. And crucially, he had Edward Sterling's unwavering public support. Edward, true to his word, had given Mark genuine authority. Their weekly meetings were not perfunctory check-ins, but robust discussions. It was during one such meeting that a touch of gentle humor surfaced. Edward, eager to demonstrate his newfound commitment to employee well-being, proudly unveiled a proposal for mandatory monthly cultural enrichment afternoon teas across all retail outlets. Mark had listened patiently then, with a slight smile, said, "Mr. Sterling, it's a noble idea. Truly. But I suspect that ensuring every store has a top-quality coffee machine that actually works, and perhaps an extra 10 minutes garantirvene for their lunch break, might be seen as slightly more culturally enriching by the staff on a daily basis." Edward had blinked, then a slow chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Point taken, Marcus. Coffee and more break time it is. Perhaps we shelve the scones for now." It was these moments of candid feedback, respectfully given and thoughtfully received, that began to forge a new kind of effective partnership between them. Mark, drawing on his first-hand knowledge, spearheaded initiatives that were both practical and impactful. He championed a revamped employee feedback system, truly anonymous this time, that bypassed obstructive middle managers. He pushed for and got a significant investment in new equipment for the stores, starting with the scanners and air conditioning units. He worked with HR to revise training programs, infusing them with modules on respectful management and genuine customer service using anonymized real-life examples, some drawn from his own experiences with Peterson. He even instituted a Quiet Hero Award, recognizing employees who, like he once, had performed small acts of exceptional kindness or integrity. The changes weren't instantaneous, nor were they met with universal acclaim. There was resistance, old habits died hard, and some initiatives stumbled before finding their footing. But gradually, tangibly, the culture at Sterling Corporation began to shift. The fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism. Employees started using the new feedback channels. Store managers, understanding the new expectations from the very top, began to listen more and dictate less. Productivity, counterintuitively to the old guard, actually began to improve as morale lifted. Edward Sterling himself was a changed man. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes was replaced by a more engaged, open expression. He spent less time in his 50th floor office and more time visiting stores, distribution centers, and call centers, not as Ed Smith, but as himself, approachable and genuinely interested. He learned names, he asked questions, and more importantly, he listened to the answers. He found a satisfaction in this new mode of leadership that all his previous financial triumphs had never quite provided. About a year after the incident at the corner stop, Sterling Corporation held its annual Employee Appreciation Day. In previous years, it had been a rather stiff, formal affair. This year, the atmosphere was palpably different, more relaxed, more genuine. Mark Cole, now a respected and well-liked figure within the company, was asked to say a few words. As he stood at the podium, he saw many familiar faces in the crowd. Sarah, the young stock girl from the corner stop, was now an assistant manager, beaming at him. He even caught sight of Mr. Arthur Dean and Mrs. Eleanor Gable invited as special community guests. He spoke not of corporate strategy, but of simple human values, respect, kindness, the courage to see and help one another. He didn't explicitly recount his own story with Edward, but everyone knew the context. He ended by saying, "Real strength isn't about how high you can climb, but how many people you can lift up with you." Later that evening, as the event wound down, Edward found Mark looking out at the city lights, much as Edward himself used to, but Mark's gaze seemed to hold a different quality, not detachment, but a sense of shared ownership. "You know, Marcus," Edward said, quietly standing beside him, "my father would have liked you." "Very much." Mark smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "I think, Mr. Sterling, he'd be proud of the man you've become again." One of their old co-workers from the corner stop, David, now a shift supervisor, came over, a playful grin on his face. "So, Mr. Cole," David said, "do we still get to call you Mark? Or is it your directorship, the Scanner Whisperer Supreme?" Now Mark laughed, the sound easy and unburdened. "Mark is just fine, David. Always. There were still challenges, of course. A corporation the size of Sterling's didn't transform overnight. There were still metaphorical frayed wires to fix, old attitudes to mend. But the seeds of change had been firmly planted in new, more fertile soil. Edward Sterling no longer looked at his employees as indistinguishable parts of a machine, but as individuals, each with a story, each with a vital role. And Marcus Cole, the quiet cashier who had once saved a disguised CEO, not with an act of heroism, but with a simple act of human decency, now helped to save the soul of an entire company. The ending wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real. It was an earned peace, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of courage and compassion, and that even a corporate titan could be reminded that the true bottom line is always ultimately human. What a journey of rediscovery that was. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often do we build walls around ourselves, brick by brick, until we can no longer see the quiet acts of courage and kindness happening just beyond them? Edward Sterling found his walls, and thankfully He also found a way to begin tearing them down, all sparked by the steadfast compassion of a man like Marcus Cole. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most profound awakenings come from the most unexpected encounters, like a faint light guiding us back to what truly matters. This story certainly gave us a lot to reflect on, and we imagine it might have for you too. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you believe was the single most important factor that enabled Edward Sterling's genuine transformation? And as we continue to craft these stories, your insights are incredibly valuable to us. If you have any suggestions on how we can make our narratives even more impactful, or if there's anything in today's story you'd like to see explored differently in the future, please don't hesitate to share your feedback. Your perspectives help us grow and bring you more meaningful content. If their journey resonated with you, please give this video a like. And if you know someone who might find inspiration or a moment of reflection in this story, feel free to share it with them. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss out on our next exploration into the moments that shape us. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, may you find light in unexpected places.